Is this summary okay?
Yes, yes.
Good. So, one possible explanation. And now let's start with a more pleasant one. So let's go to a very ideal city somewhere in France. People care a lot about politics. They read all these candidates have written. They go to their speeches. They read the newspapers. They participate in the discussions. And they use this to make a judgment whom to vote for. And just for the sake of the argument, let's assume they have not even seen their faces. Very unrealistic, but let's assume. So how then can we explain that kids in quite a different country have the same preferences? And one explanation could be these kids read it from the candidates' faces. So all the information that is there about their programs and whatsoever is on the face. I know you like metaphors, so let me bring this metaphor. It's like you have a cartoon. So some people may read the text, and some people may just read the pictures, look at the pictures. And if the cartoon is well done, they will, of course, both get the gist of the story. So has maybe nature designed people such that no matter whether you look at the face or know more about them, you always have the same preference among candidates?
Well, that's a very good, challenging question to answer. In fact, research has looked at the ability of individuals to read into characteristics of others. So, for example, in a study, they gave general intelligence tests to individuals, and then they asked another group of individuals to try to estimate the intelligence of the first group. And the only information they had was a picture of the individual. They were not very good at doing that for adults. So even though adults have a lot of experience in observing faces, in observing consequential performance that may come from that individual, they don't seem very good at linking the two things very well. We also know from research that individuals, even young babies, are able to categorize other adults and even other young babies. So this is an inborn mechanism that little babies exhibit as young as 3 to 5 months old. They can discriminate very, very well between faces that we as adults find attractive or not, or faces of babies that we find attractive or not. So we think this is a kind of program that we have that is triggered automatically when we see individuals. Now we are going beyond our data. This is collectively what the research indicates, is that we have an ability to very quickly infer from categories. So imagine we were Neanderthals now a couple of 100,000 years ago, and we were face to face with a saber-toothed tiger. Now, we would not have time to sit and observe this tiger, wondering if this is just a nice little pussycat or a man-eater. We would observe the tiger, we would immediately compare that to categories of other animals that we have, and our first reaction would be to fight or flight, run away or defend ourselves. So we wouldn't have time really to observe and see, well, it's got long canines, it's got claws, it's furry, it's big and strong, it's growling, it's probably going to eat us. So we had to make judgments very, very quickly. So we would hope that individuals will have this mechanism of judging competence and linking that competence to performance, just like when they see a saber-toothed tiger and they know it's dangerous. However, they're not very good at doing it when it comes to humans. And a very good example is the US presidency. We have many presidents like George Bush Sr., Calvin Coolidge, Warren Harding. These presidents were all dismal failures. And how did they get elected to the highest and most powerful office in the world if they were competent and intelligent? Now, in fact, what we do know is that these chaps and many others who were elected as presidents were not the, let's say, sharpest knives in the drawer. They were elected possibly because of the way they looked and for many other reasons, but certainly not on their competence. And we know that because psychologists have actually estimated the intelligence of US presidents, and they know there is great variation in the intelligence of US presidents. So if this adaptive mechanism that we have was correct, then by default we should be electing always competent politicians and always competent US presidents. In fact, we do not.
So let me, as a scientist, now again think in terms of explanation. First explanation or question was, How can we explain this finding? Kids based on faces arrive at the same preferences as ideal voters, informed citizens who only care about programs, charisma, leadership quality. The explanation would be they both have the same preferences because competence is somewhere in the face. This is something you would not subscribe to, no?
No.
Okay. Second explanation is they do not care about, now let's go to another city in France. Huh? Now this is a bit pessimistic, this picture. Imagine a set of voters who do not care about politics at all. So all they care is about, let's say, sport. So they go to the stadium to see the next soccer game, let's say Paris against Bayern Munich, and they happen to see these faces on the walls. And they look at this 10 seconds, and within these 10 seconds they make a decision, I would vote for this guy next time. Yeah? And these are exactly the same 10 seconds the children here in Lausanne had. They also didn't look longer than 10 seconds. Right?
A couple of seconds.
Okay, good. So this suggests that maybe the same processes are going on. People wouldn't take any information beyond face into account, but then we would need to make the assumption that they obviously use the same process. So same input, faces, same output, voting preferences, therefore same process. Is there any evidence that this process is somehow innate, that this is universal, that is observable both here in Lausanne, kids and adults? Do we have any evidence for that, universality?
Yeah, well, our study is one of the first that shows this universality because we had adults and children from one country rating adults in another country. There is not much research that has identified this universality hypothesis that you are suggesting. However, I'll just go back to what I said previously, is that we know that young babies are able to discriminate very well and to stereotype very well. So I wouldn't be surprised if we would be able to do this maybe even in an Asian context where people's faces are substantially different from the ones in Western societies. But we don't have a lot of data on this, so this is a good point, and perhaps some students who are watching this would be a good thesis.
So we had two explanations. One, they only go with the politics, but they happen to be correlated with the face. The other is they don't care about politics at all. They only go for the face. And maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle. Because, I mean, real voters, they've seen the faces and know the program to some extent. So how do they then combine these two pieces of information? One could argue if, or to the extent that they are somehow correlated, it doesn't really matter so much how, where they place the weights. Do we know anything about that? What's more important, what you say or how you look?
Well, I think both are very, very important. As I mentioned in the beginning, one of the first things that individual notices about somebody is the person's face. So they will classify the person on the face, and then as they receive additional information, they will adjust that initial classification. So yes, I believe as well the answer is somewhere in between. It's not only the face, however, it's not only the performance. It's a mixture of the two. And unfortunately, as we observe the performance of many politicians, we notice that many bad ones are getting in and an equal amount of good ones are getting in. If we were to select professors in the same way, we probably would have a lot of competent-looking, incompetent professors. And I might never have been selected based on my looks.
I don't want to comment on that, John. John, your findings are, I would say, not really good news for modern Western societies. So isn't the implication that we now have a system in place that does not necessarily guarantee that we have the most competent, or that we get the most competent candidates as our political leaders?
Unfortunately, these results are rather pessimistic. As I mentioned before, we do elect a lot of incompetent and a lot of competent politicians. What's very interesting is a study that was done a couple of years ago where they estimated the intelligence, the general intelligence of US presidents. And using that estimate, they were able to predict how great the president was, what the impact of the president was on the United States. Now, we shouldn't actually find that correlation because ideally, all the presidents should be very intelligent. So the fact that we have variation in intelligence means that very clever and not so clever presidents are getting elected. So the fact that IQ correlates, IQ, in other words, general intelligence, correlates with greatness, means that the individuals who make it to political office are not selected on intelligence. If they were, there would be very little variation in intelligence. Everyone would be clever. So IQ wouldn't be a factor that distinguishes the great politicians from the not-so-great politicians.
John, you start your science paper with a quote of Plato. And I like this quote a lot. I think it nicely leads into your story. So let me just read it. So in the Republic, Plato states, "Imagine a ship in which there is a captain who is taller and stronger than any of the crew. But he is a little deaf and has a similar infirmity in sight. And his knowledge of navigation is not much better." So Plato argues that the crew, that means here in our case the voters, cannot select a competent captain, in our case here a ruler, because the crew is thrown off in part by appearance. Plato uses this allegory to suggest that voters lack the rational faculties and knowledge to elect competent rulers. So now the Greek on the one hand invented democracy, but on the other hand we have Plato who was also raising the warning finger. Funny enough, 2,500 years later you raise the warning finger again. So has nothing happened in between? I mean, we are now today. Has modern political science anything to say about how we can change the system? Has Plato thought about this?
Well, Plato thought very hard and long about this, and he was accused actually of being anti-democratic, because what he observed was that if individuals were elected, we might not get the correct person into place. In other words, it's not the best pilot who will become captain of the vessel, but the one who looks stronger. However, as the quote says, that individual may be a bit blind, a bit deaf, and not a good pilot in the first place. So his critique of democracy, which is used today quite a bit, was that voters